Eden Grove was a neighborhood that prided itself on appearances. The lawns were always perfectly mowed, the houses immaculately painted, and the cars and driveways shined as though fresh off the dealership lot. Laura Bennett lived in one of its crown jewels, a sprawling craftsman with dark wood accents and a wraparound porch that seemed designed for idyllic summer evenings. Inside, however, Laura was anything but serene. The morning had started like any other. Tom had left early for work, kissing her on the cheek as he always did, while their two children, Emma and Jake, bickered over cereal choices before rushing off to school. Laura stood in the silence of the now empty kitchen, staring at the sink piled high with dishes she didn't feel like washing. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. Picking it up, she saw a text from Danielle, her closest friend in the neighborhood. "Danielle? Lunch today? Need to vent? Derek is being... the... Derek." Laura smiled faintly and typed back, "Sure, usual spot?" But her heart wasn't in it. She was growing tired of these small distractions, tired of the routine that had become her life. Burnout reigned supreme, if not always for many, as they piled up needlessly. As she turned back to the dishes, her gaze drifted to the garden beyond the window. Tom had built it for her when they first moved in, a romantic gesture to show his devotion. She'd loved it once, spending hours tending to the roses and hydrangeas. Now, it felt like a monument to a happiness she couldn't summon anymore. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Danielle. It was an unfamiliar number. "Unknown. Can I see you again?" Laura's breath hitched. The message wasn't a mistake. She knew exactly who it was, and for the first time that morning, she felt alive. 2 days earlier, Laura had attended a neighborhood barbecue at the Johnsons'. It was one of those events where the hosts hired caterers to make it seem effortless, though everyone knew the cost ran into the thousands. Laura had dressed carefully for the occasion, a flowing sundress that showed just enough leg to hint at her figure without being obvious, paired with delicate gold earrings Tom had given her years ago. As usual, Tom spent the evening networking with the men, discussing property values and local politics. Laura found herself by the bar, sipping a glass of Pinot Grigio, when she noticed him. Kevin was standing near the grill, his tanned arms crossed over his chest, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he bantered with one of the guests. He wasn't like the men in Eden Grove. There was no polish to him, no pretense. His jeans were faded, his boots scuffed, and his shirt clung to his frame in a way that was both casual and suggestive. Their eyes met and Kevin gave her a nod. Laura felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't blushed in years. Later, when most of the guests had moved inside for dessert, Laura found herself alone on the back patio, leaning against the railing. She wasn't surprised when Kevin joined her. "Nice night," he said, his voice low and rough. "It is," she replied, glancing at him. Up close he was even more striking, his jawline sharp, his eyes a piercing blue. They talked for a few minutes, the conversation light, but there was an undertone to it, an electricity Laura couldn't ignore. When he brushed her hand lightly as he gestured toward the garden, she didn't pull away. As they parted that night, Kevin handed her a business card. "If you ever need anything fixed around the house, let me know," he said, with a wink. She didn't need anything fixed, but she kept the card anyway. Laura sat in her car, parked a block away from her house, staring at the business card. She had been holding on to it for days, debating whether to call. Tom was at work, the kids were at school, and the house was empty. The temptation was too strong. Dialing the number, she took a deep breath. Kevin answered on the second ring. "Hey, this is Kevin." "Hi, it's Laura Bennett," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "You gave me your card at the barbecue." "Laura," he said, his tone brightening, "what can I do for you?" "My deck," she lied. "It's unstable. I was wondering if you could come take a look." He arrived within the hour, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that clung to his muscular frame. Laura led him through the house to the backyard, her heart pounding with every step. Kevin inspected the deck briefly before turning to her with a sly grin. "It's solid. I think you just wanted an excuse to call me." Laura laughed nervously, but her cheeks burned. Maybe. What happened next felt inevitable. The tension between them snapped like a taut wire, and they came together in a rush of hands and mouths, stumbling into the shadowed corner of the garage. Afterward, Kevin leaned against the wall, watching her as she straightened her dress. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Bennett," he said with a grin. Laura didn't reply. She left the garage and returned to the house, her mind spinning. What had she just done? Kevin wasn't the last. Once the door was open, Laura couldn't seem to close it. Each encounter gave her a high she couldn't replicate in her day-to-day life. She became bolder, taking risks she never would have imagined. With Scott, the yoga instructor, it started with innocent stretches after class, but ended in the empty studio one evening. Ben, the barista, had charmed her with free lattes and flirtatious winks, until she invited him over to discuss catering options for a neighborhood party. Each man was a different kind of thrill, a different escape from the monotony of her life. And with each affair, the lies she told herself grew louder. "It's just physical. It doesn't mean anything. I can stop anytime I want." But Laura couldn't stop. For weeks after her encounter with Kevin, Laura lived on a razor's edge. She meticulously erased every trace of their time together, deleted texts, cleared call logs, and sanitized any clues that could raise suspicion. Yet she couldn't erase the changes in herself. She noticed the way Tom looked at her differently. His gaze lingered a little too long, as though searching for something out of place. Once, as they sat across from each other at dinner, he put down his fork and asked, "Is everything okay?" Laura froze, her heart pounding. "Of course." "Why wouldn't it be?" Tom shrugged, but his brow furrowed. "You've seemed distracted lately." "I've just been busy," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Between the kids, the garden, and the charity event, it's a lot to juggle." Tom nodded, but his concern didn't fade. Laura excused herself early, retreating to the bathroom where she leaned against the sink, staring at her reflection. Was she slipping? Could Tom sense something? She pushed the thought aside. She had been careful. There was no way he could know. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the first note arrived. Laura was pruning the hydrangeas in her front yard when she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. At first she thought it was an advertisement, but when she unfolded it, her stomach dropped. The note read, "Your secrets aren't safe." Her hands trembled as she scanned the street. The neighborhood was as serene as ever. Children playing on bikes, a dog barking in the distance, Mrs. Connors from next door chatting with the mailman. No one seemed out of place. Laura shoved the note into her pocket and rushed inside, locking the door behind her. She read the message again, her mind racing. Who could have written it? Kevin? One of the others? Was this a joke? A warning? She tried to dismiss it, but the paranoia stayed with her. That night, she barely slept, jolting awake at every creak and shadow. The next morning, Laura received an unexpected text from Kevin. "Kevin, need to see you, urgent." Laura hesitated before responding. 4 in the morning, like, "Kevin, I'm coming over." Before she could tell him not to, Kevin arrived. She barely had time to pull him inside before he started talking. "Someone's been asking about you," he said, his voice low. "A guy came by one of the sites I'm working at. He showed me a picture of you and asked if I knew who you were." Laura's blood ran cold. "What did you say?" "I didn't tell him anything," Kevin assured her, "but it's only a matter of time before someone talks. You've got to get ahead of this." Laura stared at him, her mind spinning. "Do you think it's Tom?" Kevin shook his head. This guy didn't look like a jealous husband. More like a reporter or a cop. Laura's heart sank. Was someone investigating her? 2 weeks later, Kevin called her again, this time in a drunken rage. "You used me," he slurred over the phone. "I'm not some toy you can throw away when you're done." "Kevin, calm down," Laura said, panic rising in her chest. "No, you listen to me," he snapped. "You're gonna regret treating me like this. I'll make sure of it." The next day, Kevin showed up at her house, pounding on the door. "Let me in, Laura," he shouted. "We need to talk." Fearing he would draw attention, Laura opened the door and quickly pulled him inside. "What are you doing?" she hissed. Kevin's eyes were bloodshot, his face red with anger. "I'm done playing nice. You're going to pay me to keep my mouth shut, or I'll tell Tom everything." Laura's panic turned to anger. "You're not going to blackmail me," she said through gritted teeth. "But—" "Oh really?" Kevin sneered. "You think you can stop me?" In a flash, Kevin grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. Laura reacted instinctively. Her hand found the heavy candlestick on the entryway table, and she swung it with all her strength. The impact was sickening. Kevin staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock before he collapsed onto the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. For a moment, Laura stood frozen, her breathing ragged. Then survival instincts kicked in. She dragged Kevin's body to his truck, parked in the driveway, and wrestled him into the driver's seat. With trembling hands, she drove to an abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town, leaving him slumped over the wheel. When she returned home, she scrubbed the floors and threw away her blood-streaked clothes. By the time the kids returned from school, the house was spotless, and Laura was making cookies in the kitchen, her smile fixed in place. The news broke 2 days later. Kevin's body had been discovered at the construction site. The police initially ruled it an accident, but Detective Megan Ruiz wasn't convinced. "There's something off about this," she told her partner as they examined the scene. "His injuries don't match a fall, and why was he here in the first place?" Ruiz began digging into Kevin's life, uncovering his connection to Laura. When she showed up at Laura's doorstep with a few pointed questions, Laura played the role of the grieving friend perfectly. "He was such a sweet guy," Laura said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I can't believe he's gone." But inside, she was panicking. Ruiz's sharp gaze lingered too long, her questions cutting too deep. Laura knew it was only a matter of time before the detective uncovered the truth. Detective Megan Ruiz leaned against the side of her unmarked sedan, sipping from a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee as she stared at the construction site where Kevin's body had been found. She had seen plenty of accidents in her decade on the force, but something about this one didn't sit right. The official report painted it as a simple fall. Kevin had been drinking, the narrative went, and likely stumbled into an exposed beam. But Ruiz's gut told her otherwise. "You really think this is more than an accident?" her partner, Officer Paul Decker, asked as he approached. "Maybe," Ruiz replied, narrowing her eyes. "Guy's injuries don't match the story. That head wound wasn't from a fall. It was blunt force trauma. Someone clocked him hard enough to kill him, then dumped him here to cover it up." Decker raised an eyebrow. "Got a suspect in mind?" Ruiz pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket, flipping to the page with Kevin's last known contacts. "He was working for a lot of people in Eden Grove," she said. "Upscale neighborhood, lots of secrets. Start with the Bennetts. Laura Bennett called him just days before he died." Laura was in the middle of folding laundry when the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. Peering through the window, she saw a woman in a blazer standing on the porch, holding a notebook and flashing a badge to the neighborhood kids riding bikes nearby. "Detective," Laura thought, her stomach twisting. She composed herself before opening the door, arranging her features into a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Bennett?" the woman asked. "Yes," Laura replied cautiously. "I'm Detective Megan Ruiz with the Eden County Police Department. I'm investigating the death of Kevin Dalton. May I come in?" Laura hesitated but stepped aside. Ruiz walked in, her sharp eyes scanning the pristine living room. Laura offered her a seat, but Ruiz declined, standing in the center of the room like she wanted Laura to feel uncomfortable. "Mr. Dalton did some work for you recently," Ruiz began. "Yes," Laura said, clasping her hands tightly. "He was helping with some repairs in the backyard. A really nice guy. I can't believe what happened to him." "When was the last time you saw him?" Laura hesitated, pretending to think. "Maybe a week ago. He came by to check on some materials." Ruiz nodded, her expression unreadable. Did he seem upset about anything? Mention anyone who might have wanted to harm him? No, nothing like that, Laura said quickly. Ruiz studied her for a moment. It's strange. His coworkers said he'd been acting paranoid lately, like he thought someone was out to get him. You're sure there's nothing you can think of? Positive, Laura replied, her voice firm. Ruiz smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. If you think of anything, give me a call. She handed Laura her card and left without another word. As soon as the door closed, Laura collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. Laura's relief at Ruiz's departure was short-lived. That evening she received a text from an unknown number. "Unknow what you did." Her breath caught. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, "You'll find out soon enough." Fear gripped her. Was it someone connected to Kevin? Someone who had seen what happened? Her mind raced, trying to piece together who might know. She thought of Scott, the yoga instructor, who had sent her cryptic messages after she ended things with him. Or Ben, the barista, who had started showing up at her usual spots unexpectedly. Laura decided she couldn't take chances. She deleted every trace of her affairs, burned old notes and receipts, and even changed her phone number. But she knew it wasn't enough. At the same time, journalist Alex Reed was unraveling his own threads. A reporter with a nose for scandal, Alex had picked up on the peculiarities surrounding Kevin Dalton's death. His initial focus on workplace safety quickly pivoted when he discovered Kevin's long list of affluent clients. One name stood out: Laura Bennett. Alex had seen Laura before at a fundraiser for Eden Grove's PTA. She had been striking in her simplicity, the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. He remembered thinking she didn't quite fit with the polished crowd. Now, as he dug deeper into her connections, he found inconsistencies. Receipts from motels, records of phone calls to men who weren't her husband, and whispers from neighbors who had seen her sneaking around town. Alex began piecing together a story, one that would shake Eden Grove to its core. Laura's fragile calm shattered the night Alex confronted her. He caught her outside the grocery store, stepping in front of her as she loaded bags into her trunk. "Laura Bennett," he said, his voice calm but firm. Laura froze. "Do I know you?" "I'm Alex Reed, a reporter with the Eden Chronicle. I've been looking into Kevin Dalton's death." Laura's chest tightened. "Why are you talking to me about it?" "Because your name keeps coming up," Alex said, holding up a folder. "And I think you know more than you're letting on." "I don't know what you're talking about," Laura said, her voice shaking. Alex took a step closer. "I have evidence. Text messages, receipts, witness statements. It's only a matter of time before the police connect the dots. But I can help you." "How?" Laura demanded. "Give me your side of the story," Alex said. "The truth. If you don't, I'll write what I know, and it won't look good for you." Laura's mind raced. She couldn't let Alex expose her, not when Detective Ruiz was already circling. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll tell you everything. But not here." They agreed to meet later that night, but Alex would never make it to their meeting. The next morning, Alex Reed was found dead in his apartment. The police ruled it a robbery gone wrong, but Laura knew better. Someone was cleaning up loose ends. A single note was left on her doorstep that evening. "You're next." The note sat in Laura's trembling hands as she paced the living room. Every shadow in the house felt alive, every creak of the floorboards like an impending threat. Whoever was behind this knew everything. The death of Alex Reed wasn't a coincidence, and Laura was next on their list. She couldn't go to the police, not with Detective Ruiz already suspicious. Tom was out of the question. He would demand the truth and likely leave her once he learned the extent of her betrayal. For the first time, Laura realized she was truly alone. By midnight, she'd developed a plan. She would confront whoever was behind the threats. But first, she needed to find out who they were. The following day, Laura parked her car at the edge of Eden Grove and walked into the small cafe where Kevin had once taken his breaks. She hoped someone there might know more about his final days. Inside, the cafe was quiet, save for a man seated near the window. Laura recognized him instantly, one of Kevin's co-workers from the construction crew. His name was Mitch, and his gruff demeanor had always made her uneasy. "Mrs. Bennett?" Mitch greeted her with a smirk as she approached. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I need to talk to you about Kevin," Laura said, keeping her voice steady. Mitch leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "What about him? Did he mention anything unusual before he died? Did he have enemies?" Mitch chuckled darkly. Kevin wasn't the enemy-making type, but he did like to talk about his conquests. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You, for instance." Laura's face burned. "That's not what this is about." "Sure it isn't," Mitch said, his smirk widening. "Look, I don't know who killed him, but if you've got something to hide, Mrs. Bennett, you'd better hope they don't come after you next." His words sent a chill down her spine. Laura returned home to find Tom sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of him. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" Laura asked, her heart sinking. "Do you want to tell me what these are?" Tom said, sliding the papers across the table. Laura's blood ran cold as she saw what they were. Printouts of phone records, receipts, and even a grainy photo of her with Kevin at the hotel. "Where did you get these?" she demanded. "That doesn't matter," Tom said, his voice low. "What matters is that you explain how you've been lying to me for months, years, maybe." Laura sat down, her hands shaking. "I can explain." Tom slammed his hand on the table, cutting her off. "Explain. You've been cheating on me. Do you think I'm stupid?" Tears welled in Laura's eyes. "It wasn't like that." "Don't lie to me," Tom shouted, standing up. "You've destroyed everything." Laura broke down, sobbing into her hands. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "Here's what's going to happen," Tom said coldly. "You're going to pack a bag and leave. Tonight. I'll deal with the kids. But you're not staying here." Laura found herself driving aimlessly through the dark streets, her belongings hastily packed in the back seat. She couldn't go to a hotel, not with Detective Ruiz's questions and the shadow of Alex Reed's death looming over her. She finally stopped at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled of mildew, the wallpaper peeling from the corners, but it was a place to think. Laura laid out her options. She could run, leave Eden Grove behind and start over somewhere new. But the threats wouldn't stop, not unless she figured out who was behind them. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from another unknown number. "Unknown. Midnight. The old mill. Come alone." The old mill sat on the edge of town, abandoned and crumbling. Its towering structure loomed against the night sky as Laura pulled up, her headlights cutting through the darkness. She stepped out of the car, clutching the knife she'd taken from the motel's kitchenette. Every step toward the mill felt heavier than the last. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. Laura's footsteps echoed as she moved through the cavernous space, her eyes darting to every shadow. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Mitch. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Laura's breath caught. Mitch laughed. "Not all of them, just enough to scare you. You see, Mrs. Bennett, Kevin told me all about you, and I figured, why let a good opportunity go to waste?" "What do you want?" Laura demanded. "Same thing Kevin wanted. Money. Lots of it," Mitch said, stepping closer. "Or maybe I just let the cops know what you've been up to. Let them figure out why Kevin really died." Laura gripped the knife tighter. "Stay away from me." But Mitch didn't stop. "You're not in control here, sweetheart. You're just a bored little housewife who—" Before he could finish, Laura lunged, the knife plunging into his side. Mitch staggered back, clutching at the wound, his face twisted in pain. Laura didn't wait to see if he would recover. She ran, her heart pounding, as Mitch's curses echoed behind her. Laura's chest heaved as she sped away from the old mill, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Mitch's blood was still splattered on her hands, her clothes, and her mind. She couldn't stop seeing his face as he fell, the knife buried in his side, his sneering confidence replaced by pain and rage. She pulled into the parking lot of the motel where she'd been hiding and stumbled into her room. The reality of what she'd done crashed over her like a wave. She had killed a man. There was no spinning it, no justification. She scrubbed her hands in the bathroom sink until her skin felt raw, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. But no amount of washing could cleanse her of the memory. I had no choice, she told herself. He was going to ruin me. But even as she tried to rationalize it, she knew she was running out of time. Detective Ruiz stared at the photos spread across her desk, each one a snapshot of Laura Bennett's unraveling life. A grainy security image showed Laura meeting Kevin Dalton at a motel. Another, taken days later, captured her arguing with Mitch outside the cafe. Ruiz had pieced together enough to know Laura was at the center of something far bigger than a string of bad luck. Kevin's death, Mitch's disappearance, and now whispers from other sources about her connection to several men in town. "What's your gut say?" Decker asked, leaning over her shoulder. Ruiz tapped her pen against the desk. "She's hiding something, and I think she's more dangerous than anyone realizes." Decker frowned. "You think she killed Kevin?" Ruiz nodded slowly. "And I think she killed Mitch, too." Laura awoke to the sound of pounding on her motel door. She froze, her mind racing. Was it the police? Mitch, miraculously alive and seeking revenge? When she peeked through the curtain, she saw Tom standing outside. "Laura," he called, his voice tense, "open the door." But her hands shook as she unlocked it. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom stepped inside, his expression hard. "I followed you." Laura's stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because I knew you were lying," he said, his tone sharp. "About everything." Laura looked away, guilt clawing at her. "What do you want from me, Tom?" "The truth," he demanded. "Who are you, Laura? Because you're not the woman I married." Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know who I am anymore." Tom's face softened, but only slightly. "The cops came by the house again. They're closing in on you, Laura. If there's anything you haven't told me, now's the time." She hesitated, the weight of her secrets threatening to crush her. "It's too late for that," she said finally. Laura hadn't expected Mitch to survive. But 2 days after their confrontation at the mill, she received another text. Unknown. "You should have finished the job. Now it's my turn." Her hands trembled as she read the words. Mitch was alive, and he wasn't done with her. The next morning, her car window was smashed. Later that evening, she returned to the motel to find her door ajar. Inside, the room had been trashed. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, and scrawled on the mirror in bright red lipstick were the words, "You're mine." Laura's fear turned to fury. She had let Mitch control her for too long. If he wanted a war, she was ready to fight. Desperation drove Laura to make a bold decision. She called Detective Ruiz. "I have information," Laura said when the detective answered. "But I need your protection." Ruiz's voice was skeptical. "Protection from what?" "Someone is after me," Laura said, her voice trembling. "I know things about Kevin Dalton's death." "And Mitch." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" Ruiz asked finally. Laura gave her the address of the motel, knowing it was a risk. She had no choice. When Ruiz arrived, Laura laid out as much of the truth as she dared. She admitted to knowing Kevin and Mitch but painted herself as a victim of their schemes. "They blackmailed me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Kevin wanted money, and when I refused, Mitch came after me. He's still coming after me." Ruiz listened, her expression unreadable. "And what about Alex Reed?" Laura froze. "Who?" "The reporter," Ruiz said, her tone sharp. "He was investigating Kevin and you. He ended up dead. Convenient, don't you think?" Laura shook her head vehemently. "I had nothing to do with that." Ruiz leaned back, studying her. "We'll see." The final confrontation came on a stormy night. Mitch lured Laura to a remote cabin, claiming he had proof that could clear her name if she came alone. Laura arrived armed with the same knife she'd used at the mill. Inside the cabin, Mitch was waiting, his face pale, but his sneer intact. "You've made a mess of things," he said, circling her like a predator. "But I can make it all go away. For a price." Laura's grip on the knife tightened. "You think you can threaten me?" Mitch laughed. "Sweetheart, I've already won." The fight was brutal and chaotic, ending with Mitch dead and Laura bloodied but alive. She staggered out of the cabin into the pouring rain, collapsing as flashing red and blue lights surrounded her. Months later, Laura sat in a courtroom, her fate in the hands of a jury. The trial had captivated the nation, with every sordid detail of her affairs and crimes laid bare. Detective Ruiz testified against her, painting a damning picture of a woman driven by greed, lust, and desperation. But Laura's lawyer argued she was a victim, forced to act in self-defense against dangerous men. The jury deliberated for days before returning their verdict. Guilty. As Laura was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Tom sitting in the gallery. His face was blank, his eyes cold. For Laura, the story was over. But for Eden Grove, the scars of her actions would linger for years to come.